prefer to actually have a open kind of a discussion. This format is not very useful for that. But what we try and do is that I will be a little provocative this morning, and then we can have a fairly frank and open discussion. I know many of you have come from many parts of the country, and this is not the easiest time to be in service. In fact, I was just telling Narendra this morning that a long time back, maybe more than 25 years ago, when I used to go and teach with other colleagues who are now pretty senior in service at the academy, I used to spend time looking at rural development. But today I'm speaking about urban issues. So one's own work cuts across both of those things, and I think one of the big challenges that we have today is to try and see how we can keep the balance between the two. There is a lot of change happening, and I'm not sure we're all entirely prepared for the changes that are happening in the country today and at the world at large. So last year when I spoke, I focused a lot on questions of equity and inclusion. Today, partially I guess because of my own preoccupations, I'm going to focus a lot on the larger global trends, which I'm finding that many of us, because we're steeped in so many changes that are happening at state level or even within the government of India, we're sort of a little bit maybe out of touch with. So as I said, this is going to be provocative. I will show you a fair amount of evidence. There will be a presentation that I leave for you here. There is a strong nostalgia for a different kind of life in India, and there's been a long debate. This is not a new debate. This is a debate that started about 100 years ago. It continued between Gandhi, Nehru and Ambedkar in the pre-independence era. And in some senses, I think we're still locked into an imagination in which India lives in its villages. And that there may be some questions about today, especially over the next 20 years. So the past in some senses is useful. It gives us a rooting. It gives us a cultural basis to try and look at where we come from and how we administer and how we manage. But the future is changing so quickly that, not only with our children, but with our systems that we're working with, we might be severely surprised. So, if I look at 4 or 5 critical things that we have to achieve over the next 20 or 30 years, these are fairly obvious things. The plans have dealt with them since the mid-70s. I was part of the first MTR for the 7th plan a long time back. I mean, we have 5 plans since then. But our achievements on these counts have been somewhat limited. So the first thing, which is absolutely uncontested in some sense, politically or otherwise, and we have to deliver on, and we haven't been doing very well, is on reduced poverty and inequality. So on poverty, there's been some decline, and there's a big debate about this, on how we actually measure it, etc. Some of us have written on that. But essentially, that is a non-negotiable as far as this country is concerned, both in rural and urban areas. It's not as simple as it may seem, especially in the current economic environment. The last 2 plans have focused on inclusive economic growth. There are lots of debates on what that actually means. To put it very simply, as far as I'm concerned, inclusive economic growth essentially means that the lower quartile at least, or the bottom 3 or 4 deciles, should actually grow. Their real income should grow faster than the median. This is a somewhat debated view because people look at inclusive growth as a whole set of rather arbitrary indicators. But the question, of course, is if there's no convergence that takes place, there's a serious question. And in a world which is increasingly connected, in a world in which most young people have cell phones and increasingly watch television, it's no longer possible to be able to maintain the kind of disparities and inequalities that we had. So this is a hard question, and I think it has to be answered both practically and in analytical terms. Underlying that, at least to my mind, and Professor Pani has worked on this, is the issue of social transformation. I mean, the most important thing I think in this country that's been happening over the last 10 or 15 years is not so much the story of liberalization, and I will talk about that. It is the story of how social transformation is actually changing our landscape. That is a central question. Whether it is girls going to school on bicycles, which is a big shift, I think, from when many of us started working on rural development many years back and now, to dealing with asymmetries around the whole range of
social challenges we have here. That is probably the most important dynamic, and I'll sort of try and deal with that. But then there are also very serious challenges around the environment. If you don't have an environment that supports you, especially if you're poor and you're vulnerable, you're in deep trouble. So environmental sustainability is a very serious challenge. It's not easy to deal with. There are continual conflicts, and we see that pretty much every day from the Green Bench and sometimes from the Supreme Court. This is a real challenge that I guess you face as administrators all throughout. How does one balance out growth, dealing with poverty, dealing with development, and being able to protect the environment? I mean, these are contradictory sort of objectives that are situated not only in development practice, but also in the way the Constitution is structured. And finally, I think one of our most serious challenges at the current point of time, and that of governance, is to maintain unified and a robust polity. And this is something that we are having to sort of rebuild. Yes?
My question relates to inequality.
Yes.
According to your view,
yes,
the inequalities should increase further or it should decrease further?
This is a big debate. There is one school which basically holds that in order for inequality to reduce in the long run, it has to increase in the short run. I'm not necessarily somebody who sort of believes in that. And I think the whole question of how one deals with social transformation is very closely tied to the question of how inequality needs to be dealt with. And we know, for example, relatively clearly over the last 10 years or so, as we've had this growth spurt, is that inequality along many dimensions, especially when you look at multidimensional poverty, has deepened. So, that's the objective fact. Sorry.
If you go to the incidence of increased poverty and inequality in Indian agriculture,
yes,
as far as I recollected,
yeah,
I think this wherever inequality has increased, poverty has also increased.
In some cases, yes.
There is a positive correlation. Otherwise also, I mean, it's a matter of common sense. If a person is having, say, 1,000 rupees, one man is having 1,000 rupees, and 999 persons are having 1 rupee. So their poverty can decrease only when the inequality comes down. So I personally feel that in the case of India, where the inequalities are so rampant, I think this decrease in inequality must remain on the forefront of any balanced regional urban development.
Yes, I would tend to agree with you there. The challenge, of course, is that poverty is typically measured on an annual basis, and we have to look at capital formation, and we have to look at wealth to be able to understand the real basis of inequality. And I'll show you some evidence on that. So let me quickly take you through a long view of where we're coming from. And this, in some senses, many of you may know this, but most people don't necessarily have this sense. And so basically, this is a long view of economic development over the last 500 years or so. This looks at the share of global economic output by national sort of share. And what you'll see here, if I put it very quickly, is, and I guess in the mid-18th century, India and China made up about 55% of global output. And then there was a process of colonization for India. There was a contact, and this is a Boxer Rebellion here in China. There was a dramatic decline in the share of global economic output for these two major Asian powers. And you saw the rise of our former colonial masters, the United Kingdom, and then of course you saw Russia, US, etc., etc., etc. So that's a long view of history in terms of economic output. But the most important thing that may be useful to see is China's dramatic rise. So we were very close, in the 1980s and 1990s, dramatic rebound by China, and potentially, and these were projections that were made before the growth slowdown here, a similar kind of thing, but a lagged impact as far as India is concerned. Fine. So I mean, this is the long view of economic history. The important thing, I guess, here is that, and this is very important because I guess for those of us who have 10 or 15 years of service still left, Asia is returning to the center of the global economy after a gap of 250 years. This is an important thing to understand. Of course, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was this very bullish view of the fact that nothing could go wrong with India. We are in a little bit of some challenges at the current point of time, but the long-range trend, I would imagine, would continue. So this is the context in which we're working with the change in the way that the world is currently organized in terms of growth. So just to look at the world map, I tend to invert it. I don't know whether you can see it very clearly, maybe you can cut some of the lights. So that's the world map, not the way that we normally see it, from the north upwards, but to try and show you that we have to look at the world differently to be able to see what's happening. So the center of the world economy between the 16th and the 18th century, fine, was in what we call the Indian Ocean Pacific Basin. It was where the Europeans essentially came to be able to, thank you, to be able to find the center of global wealth, of economic development, etc. So that's where the world economy was situated. That's where Vasco da Gama and everybody else came to make their fortunes. And then over the 19th and the 20th century, the center of the world economy moved to the North Atlantic. Right? That was a period of decline that I showed you there. And then towards the end of the 20th century, it shifted to what we call the Pacific Basin, the big battle between America and Japan, and all of that stuff that happened at that point of time, and then the rise of China. The interesting thing that we have to understand is that in the early and mid 21st century, over the next 20 or 30 years, as much as we saw the rebound of India and China, the center of the world economy is shifting, or has probably already shifted, to the Indian Ocean Pacific Basin. And you see this in the policies of the United States, of a whole range of other places. I mean, this is an empirical fact. The reason I'm trying to lay this out for you here is, this has a lot to do with cities, it has a lot to do with potentially our own future, and it's a lot to do with how we view ourselves and we view other things. So basically the contention is, these new geographies could create new 21st century histories, and of course the big and fundamental challenge for us is our relationship with not only our immediate neighbors, but to our neighbor to the north and whatever. So again, another view of this. I think the important thing for you to actually watch here is not so much the maps, but the numbers at the bottom here, fine? So this is just the largest cities in the world, above 750,000 in 1900, about 100 years ago. And you can see where the major cities were. The only ones that we have here, this was the capital of British India. This is before the capital moved from Delhi from Kolkata to Delhi, before the partition of Bengal took place. That of course is Mumbai. See where the concentration of capital and the major cities are. Huh? And look at the numbers here. Population of the world, 1.5 billion. The urban share is only 13%. Fine, 100 years ago. This is an estimate of the gross world product. This is from DeLong, from University of Berkeley, about 2 trillion. This is in 2012 prices. And the urban share of the global economy is about 30%. Fine. So what's that number? And I'll show this changing. So just after independence, just before our first census, process of decolonization, look at the world map. Look at the shift that is taking place. I'll just toggle you between these two. 1900 to 1950. What's happening? Population has gone from 1.5 to 2.5 billion. The share has gone from 13 to 29%. The gross world product has increased. Relatively so. The Second World War was a growth period that's there. The urban share goes up considerably. This is a shift. So in spite of industrialization in Europe and North America, etc., there's a more significant shift across the global economy. And you can see that reflected in the growth of cities of 750 million. This is from the UN population forecast, the new paper that's coming out of my very next year. Fast forward another 50 years, and look at the pattern of where urbanization is happening and where it's actually played itself out. You find the hyper-urbanization of Latin America, you find the rapid growth taking place both in South Asia and in China. And of course you start this major build-out that's happening here in parts of Africa. Look at the numbers here, 6 billion people, 1999, urban share 47%, gross world product, dramatic, remember this is 2012 numbers, dramatic growth to 65 trillion, the urban share touching nearly 70%. Okay, 68%. Fine. So there's something very dramatic happening here, which we don't necessarily notice. In 2000, we're still debating a whole range of other things as far as India is concerned. We're sort of just past the first phase of our liberalization. But there's something else happening in the world which is quite strong. And then, of course, this is sort of, I took the satellite image to look at it. This is the 2013 numbers. We're about 7 billion just now. The urban share is about 50%, slightly more than that. The gross world product is about 70 trillion or so. And the urban share is about 70%. Fine. So this is your fundamentals at the moment. But the challenge is not that. The challenge is here. In 2025, let's say about two plans from now, if we still have plans at that point of time, Global population at 8 billion, urban share at 58%, the world product at about 85 trillion, the urban share at 75%. Okay? So look at this transition in 125 years from 1.5 billion, okay, and 2 trillion to 8 billion and 85 trillion. Let me show you a table. Again, these are estimates, just to give you a sense of the scale of the change that's taken place. Right? 1.5 billion, 2.5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion. So there's a slowing off, obviously. But look at the urban share. Look at this significant process that happened here in these 50 years when most of us, I guess, were born and came into service. And look at the rate of economic growth, which of course is now starting to slow across the world, and look at the urban share here. So if you look at the current position in the world today, and of course there's tremendous inequalities between countries, between people within countries, and you know the United States is one of the worst examples as far as that is concerned. Sorry? Where was that? Sorry, that's a mistake. This should be, yes. This should be in 1950. I beg your pardon. Thanks for the correction. Yeah, that's an error there. Should be picked up. That's 1950. Beg your pardon. So if I look at the numbers here, you're talking about a global output of about $50 trillion coming from urban areas, vis-a-vis about 20 trillion coming from rural areas. Fine. And that's natural because we were going through this transition. There's an industrialization happening in many parts of the world. There's also a shift away from agriculture. But the more important thing, of course, is if you look at the incremental growth during this period of time here, between this and this share going up that's there, you're adding an incremental $1 trillion a year coming from urban areas across the world. And that's the fundamental challenge that we have. The challenge, of course, which I haven't shown here, is that we still have a very large number of people of this, let's say this 7 billion, 3.5 billion people who are dependent on the 30% of this, which is 20 trillion. Both in terms of trade, in terms of economic output, in terms of opportunity. That's a fundamental challenge, and there's an even deeper issue there. The deeper issue is, and that's true especially for India and also for China, and China is really facing their challenges now, is that we have a large number of people who live in rural areas who have an education which is, they haven't actually gone, they have never completed school education. Typically they're above the age of 30. And essentially what that means is if they're going to live till the age of 70 or 80, they're trapped in an economic situation that they cannot change. That can change maybe for the children, but they're effectively trapped. And this is a large number of people. We're talking now about hundreds of millions of people who are in that. And that's one of our most serious development challenges that we have. So the rural and urban story is an interesting one. But the challenge of how we're going to deal with an aging population, and especially one in which there are a large number of poor people who cannot, out of their own effort, in spite of whatever they may do, I mean, they labor and work very hard to be able to make this process sort of work for themselves. So that is the fundamental transition that's taking place. This is not inevitable. Right? I mean, if you look at the long view of history, countries and civilizations, especially urban ones, are very fragile. They last maybe for 100 to 200 years, they often collapse. But this is the history of the last 125 years, and it is possible that some of these trends would actually continue. And the most significant question, of course, I can show you here. You can see very quickly. I'll just show this to you. Between 1950 and 2050, this is the big shift that you're taking place. You just look at the transition that's taking place there. And of course, the most important places where these changes are taking place is in South Asia and in China. Now, many people confuse this by saying that India is experiencing an urban explosion. In some senses, if you live in cities and you encounter traffic and all that kind of thing, part of that is true. But the reality is that South Asia has one of the lowest rates of urbanization in the world. We are actually very, very exceptional compared to Latin America and including, and compared to East Asia at the current point of time. Our levels of urbanization are much lower than they should be at our current levels of GDP per capita. And part of that is a definitional issue, and I'll show it to you in a short while. But part of it is also the nature of, I guess, both our culture and our economy. And of course, the great conundrum and tragedy, I think, over the last 10 years, and I hope we should be able to deal with this fairly soon, and that is an inability to create adequate livelihoods, both in rural and urban areas. And this is a serious challenge. It's not so simple. These are structural issues that I'm trying to deal with here. they're not sort of simple to deal with through schemes and programs, and whether it's the NREGA or the National Urban Livelihood Mission, etc. Some of them are not sort of able to look at this. But there is one more thing that I sort of try and bring to your attention. So there's been this rapid, huge growth of economic output, consumption, all those kind of things. But that's had its toll. So there's a great opportunity there, and some people have used it very effectively. China has moved a large proportion of its population out of poverty in the last 20 years or so, while we've done somewhat worse. But there is a significant toll. I don't know. These are two photographs that are taken, and I guess you recognize this peak here. This is the largest mountain in the world. This is a very significant glacier. This was reproduced just 3 years ago. The same shot was taken, and look at the difference. Fine. So Kedarnath, as I've written and said, Kedarnath was just a reminder to us that we're going to have some serious challenges. Kedarnath is what we call a precursor climate event, a precursor sort of extreme weather event. But underlying that is this transition. So there's been a fundamental transition. I'm only showing you one. I'm only showing you things that relate to temperature and climate change. Right? There are a whole range of other global environmental changes happening. There's desertification, there is loss of forest cover, there's ocean acidification, which is probably the most horrendous of all, but most people don't understand what that means. So what does it mean? And I'll just show you the evidence here. This is not going to be in the slide that I'm leaving you because it's not been published. This is just going out to the IPCC this week. So you're privileged to see this. This is the history of temperature rise over the last 100 years or so. And you can see here the growth in global temperatures. They're going from relatively, same temperatures all the way to 1.75 degrees over 100 years. And these are cities that are growing most rapidly. So just visually what I'm trying to show you is the growth of urban areas and the growth of consumption, and of course then of, let's say, pollution. This is only one form of pollution, is leading to dramatic changes. Of course, maybe not so much in this part of the world, but it will come. But in other parts of the world, especially towards the poles, because the planet is a complex place. The physics of climate are complicated. So this is a historical fact, right? This will appear next year in March after it goes through all the national governments. But this is where it starts getting a little hairy. So this is a projection for the 2050s using again those big larger urban centers, 3/4 of them. And you can see some interesting trends here. Okay, the colors are not coming across so well, but as you move towards the pole, this is a mean rise of about, let's say, 3.5 to 4 degrees centigrade. This scenario is not going to happen. This scenario is not going to happen because we did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, and we did not do enough in the 1990s. Right? So we have now crossed the 450 ppm threshold, which basically means that a mean temperature rise at the equator of 2 degrees is going to happen. Now, a mean temperature rise of 2 degrees at the equator means that at the poles it will be about somewhere between 2.5 to 3 times that. So if 2 degrees at the equator means about 6 degrees at the poles, it also means that the terrestrial values will be about 3 degrees or so. Fine. So this could have been, if Rio had worked for us in 1992, and the Americans had actually gone along with this, and we are actually going to implement that, this is what might have happened. This is one of the low carbon scenarios. This is what we're on track for. Fine. So in 2050, this is what the latest climate models show you. As far as we're concerned here, Bangalore, of course, is a wonderful climate, but still, we're talking about an elevation of about 2 degrees at the mean here, right? But the really dramatic thing that you start seeing is in the northern hemisphere, and of course in Antarctica. Right? So this thing that you see here is a 6-degree rise. Okay, essentially what that means is, as we know already, because the Russians are starting to prospect for oil, the first ships have gone through the Arctic passages. We'll have an ice-free North Pole in the next 10 to 15 years. And that, of course, is even more serious challenge, because when Antarctican ice starts melting, we're going to have a dramatic change that's happening. Right? So this is in the 2050s. This is given current emission rates. And where are these emissions coming from? They're basically coming from our cities. They're coming from the lifestyle that we have. They're coming from, eventually India has a very low per capita output at the current point of time, but in gross terms, we are going to become one of the largest emitters in the world. They're coming from our aspirations to be a middle class global power. And then, of course, the really bad story is what happens not now, over the next 20 or 30 years while we're alive, but when our children are alive. That's the situation for 2070. If we don't actually reduce emissions in this country by about 60%. I mean, there was a big furor in Parliament when Janan Ramesh announced this thing. Of course, there was a whole range of politics around this, that India would, like with China, would dramatically start decreasing our own emissions. Fine. So this is a really, really bad story. And the challenge about the climate system is that once you put the stuff into the system, it takes about 150, maybe 200, 300 years for it to work itself out. So this is really bad news. So, you know, the question that I ask people very often when we go to this image here, you know, I don't know whether any of you were at Kumbh this year, or the people from UP. The Kumbh Mela became a celebrity event because Harvard people came in and did some work, and they took the chief minister to Harvard and stuff like that. The reality, of course, is 2 Kumbhs from now, let's say 26 years from now, you will probably go through a situation where there will first be flooding, and it is possible that in the Kumbh of whatever it is, 2039, that you may not have very much water at Prayag. And almost certainly in the Kumbh after that, you will probably not have any water. So what I'm saying is that, you know, we talk about the idea of India, some of these things cut across a whole range of cultural practices and, you know, our belief of who we are. We've created this. This is sort of human-induced processes. So what I'm saying is this tremendous growth of both people and output and all these kind of things, but it is also undermining our ability to be able to manage and control our world. So, I mean, I guess the fundamental question that we're asking here is that in this, the challenge of the 21st century is how does one actually enable these 9 billion people, and of course we're going to be the largest population on the planet, 1.6 or so, 1.5 billion people, how are we going to be able to support them? So our present consumption requires about twice what the world can provide us in terms of economic or ecological services. Our population growth, going from whatever it is, 7 to about 9.5 million, will require about 1.5 times that. And of course, the most important question, as far as India is concerned, ending poverty, and I'm not talking about extreme poverty here, at present throughput will require about 2 wars. Unfortunately for us, we only have one planet. So I think the most fundamental challenge of this century is how we make this transition. How do you make this transition? And it's a social transition, it's a cultural transition, but fundamentally it is a development transition. It's asking not only the question of how can one enable the end of poverty, which is, as I said, both politically, economically and socially unacceptable, but simultaneously at the same time asking the question of how much is enough. And that's a hard question, it's a deep cultural question. We're probably not asking that enough. And in our day-to-day world, because, you know, life is so complicated, we are managing with so many things, from political pressures to the Supreme Court to, you know, the everyday challenges of ordinary people and the dissatisfaction with the Indian state. This is something that we often forget. So the real issue, as far as urbanization is concerned, is this traverse will be played out in cities. Very simply, because, you know, even now, a third of India is not connected to electric grid power. So it's not the villages where all of this will be played out. So, say what it means is that if your per capita income consumption levels have to rise above a certain a certain base level, it will mean that you'll have to maintain a certain amount of growth. You have to maintain a certain amount of growth, and if you have that certain amount of growth, the growth will lead to greater consumption. The consumption will lead to, like I showed you, more carbon emissions. So typically, you know, if you look at energy systems, in energy systems, if you're growing at about 8%, your energy throughput may grow at about, you know, anywhere between 1.25 to 1.5 times that, depending on how energy intense it is, and then depending on how you know, carbon intensive your energy chain is, your carbon intensity may be growing by about 1.5 times that. So essentially what we're saying is that if you continue in the current way of dealing with things, I'm not saying that we should not end poverty, I'm saying that this is a very interesting global conflict that's there. This is a conflict that's absolutely on the table when we're negotiating on UNFCCC, starting from Mrs. Gandhi's, you know, whole statement in 1972 at Stockholm, where she said that, you know, poverty is the greatest polluter. It's a very serious challenge. But since we are all part of a global system, there's continuous pressure on us on the question of carbon space. Because carbon space, in a sense, is critically related to energy, and energy is critically related to industrialization, and industrialization notionally is connected to employment. which is for us one of the critical ways of trying to address, of, let's say, productive employment, of addressing the question of poverty. No, it doesn't necessarily so, and I'll show you some evidence of that. Sure, of course, absolutely. So the big challenge, and I'm just trying to sort of lay these ideas out so we can debate them very quickly, is, again, a quick idea. It's here, what I've tried to show you is this is the ecological footprint, which is a proxy in a sense for, let's say, environmental throughput, ecological services, and this is, of course, probably one of the best proxies that we have for welfare. So consumption is not adequate. So this is a Human Development Index. This is a long-run trend between 75 and 2005 of some of the major countries in the world. That's India, fine. So India, basically our throughput is not very high because we have lots of poor people and we don't consume very much. Of course, this is changing. And you can see China changing quite rapidly because they're moving towards the United States, both in terms of aspiration and throughput. And you see a very interesting trend here. And the trend is that the US, in spite of whatever it's done, it's environmental laws, legislations, etc., because they consume so much, they consume 4 to 8 times the amount of the rest of the world, in spite of all the things they've done, they have really not been able to bring down their resource consumption. This is a question that we have. You know, the American dream is certainly unaffordable for the Americans. The question is, if we actually believe what comes down our television, at least for many of our children, it's unaffordable for the Chinese and certainly for us. So the big challenge is, if you want to get to an HTI of about 0.9 or so, which means that you deal with all these questions, poverty, health, education, etc., 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 you have to do that at an ecological footprint of 1 for it to be sustainable. Fine. That means that the entire world system has to move towards in this direction over the century. The challenge is this. The challenge is the political economy of change. And this is the Russian collapse that took place after the Soviet collapse that took place. You know, the Europeans are coming down, etc. So the big question here is really, can the Americans do this? This is a big fight that's happening in Congress, like as of last week. It is American lifestyles versus the healthcare bill, because the question here is, you know, if you're trying to maintain welfare by producing throughput that's there, how do you do it? The oil companies will pull in one direction, the senators with the Republicans will push in another direction, but you need to bring this down, in spite of shale gas. At the moment, you know, they're all American energy security is sort of situated around shale gas, and they're in a little bit of a bubble as far as that's concerned, which is going to hit them very, very, very severely in the long run. For us, of course, the opportunity is that our levels of development are so poor that we can actually potentially tunnel through, and this, I think, is a great opportunity for India. And this is an opportunity, interestingly, which people don't talk about because it's not under the standard formulation of development theory. The standard development theory is to do what China does, fine. Essentially, you move a large population of people out of agriculture, out of rural employment, move them into an industrial regime as their, you know, their human development improves, as they get educated, and then you move them to services. That's a, you know, standard transition. India is exceptional, and there are a whole range of reasons for this, lots of theory on this and practice. We are actually a services-led economy at the moment. And this is a problem for us just now because we're not being able to actually enable significant amounts of manufacturing employment, and it's a real issue for us both macroeconomically because we're importing so much from countries like China, but also because of the question of jobs. The challenge for us is how to be able to make this transition here, to make the welfare transition without actually consuming an awful lot more. And the answer to that is, again, not so much in our villages, it is in the relationship between cities and villages, and also how we structure our cities. Because the real consumption, as also the real capital formation, is taking place in our cities, as I'll show you in a short period of time. And I guess this is the real conundrum. The opportunity for India, of course, is that we still have a large number of villages. This country has 640,000 villages, 1.4 lakh villages. We have just 8,000 urban centers, which means that there is a possibility of another way, as you know, of development, which tries to keep the balance. And also the other very interesting thing is, unlike China, which has made this now very dramatic push, they've just announced this in their current plan as the new government took over, to move the bulk of their population into urban areas. It's again, it's already the largest urbanization in the world, it's going to become even faster. We have the opportunity of trying to keep the balance, because in 2050, the big question for us, and I'll show it to you in a second, is what is the balance between rural and urban areas? Okay. So the challenge for us, of course, globally is, can China do this? Can it bend the curve instead of going up the US way? Because if it goes up the US way, then what I showed you in 2070 is absolutely certainly going to happen. Okay, and that's horrendous. I mean, you know, Basically, India as we know it is going to end in many ways. We talk, I don't know whether any of you have handled drought relief and things like that. Those are actually going to be very small things in the changes that we see, especially in agricultural systems and even for urban centers. So the question, of course, for us is, can we do this? Of course, it will never be this. There will be a transition. There will be a bit of a hump there. And that relates also, because we're talking about Kuznets here, to the question of inequality and environmental justice. So very, very quickly, I just take you through a frame, and this comes from the UN. The UN is struggling at the moment to try and define a new development agenda from 2015. There are things called the Millennium Development Goals, which are currently in place. In India, we call them the National Development Goals between 2000 and 2015. But what has been realized, I think, across the world post 2008 is that all the countries of the world are actually in the same boat for the first time after the collapse. Right? So the new SDGs, which I'm sort of part of the process, that's why I put it up in orange. I co-lead the process of trying to define an urban goal for the UN system. Picks up 10 things that need to get done. And this is sort of imperative, and it's not only imperative for the countries of the South, because the MDGs are about poor people in poor countries. It is about all countries across the world. So this is the current framing. It is currently in the General Assembly at the moment. It will come out by the end of September 2014. But the interesting thing that I wanted to point out, that's why the number 7 thing was, for the first time, 2 new goals have come in. The other ones are obvious, they've been there. Poverty has been on the agenda for whatever, since Marx has been around, 150 years. This is a somewhat new one. This is a 21st century goal. How do you achieve development within planetary boundaries? How do you do it within resource flows? Education has been around. Gender equality, social inclusion and human rights is something that's a mid-20th century goal. It comes from the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. Health has been around. Agricultural system and rural prosperity has been around. But cities, climate change are absolutely new goals, because it's a 21st century goal. It's only in the 21st century, 2006 actually, that we became a 50% urban planet. And climate change was something that we didn't even talk about till Rio in 1992. So there's a challenge of historical transitions of the 19th and the 20th century, decolonization and development, etc. There are also new goals. Because the world is now very full. It's gone from 1.5 billion, it's going to touch 9 billion. The world has changed very, very dramatically as we're speaking, as we live longer. So this is a larger framework. So the thing that we're working on just now is and I'm laying this out because this is something, there's a debate, and we're talking to the government of India on this, whether the government of India will support this formulation here, of what this goal would look like. So we're saying we should make all cities socially inclusive. So we're talking about social transformation. This is something that's come across globally. Economically productive, environmentally sustainable, secure and resilient. And of course, to do that, the most critical thing is dealing with governance and enabling urban transformation. Right? Within that, there are 3 critical targets. The first one is to end poverty, expand employment and productivity, and raise living standards. The second one is focusing on universal access to secure and affordable built environment, which is sort of maps a lot onto the new programs we're seeing coming from the government of India, though probably a little bit more radical than what we're doing. Enabling basic urban services. An interesting thing that you see here, low carbon energy and transport, mobile and broadband communication appearing on the agenda for the first time. Right? So people are seeing this as essential things that make up basic services. We're still talking, of course, about water supply, sanitation, which are absolutely critical. You can't, unless you get them, you can't put other things into place. And then, of course, dealing with all the big externalities, and to do that efficiently around land use and dealing with disasters and climate. So this is the way it's currently being framed. It may come out a little bit differently at the end of the year next year, but we hope to see within the global development framework a focus on cities for the first time. Okay, so what I'm saying is that there should be an echo at some point of time of this in government of India policy, and I suspect we could be leaders in this process if we are able to recognize that cities are absolutely important, as important or equally important as cities. So very, very quickly, actually I'm going to skip this slide for a second because we're running out of time, to show you what's been happening in this country. So I gave you a big overview looking at the larger dynamics, but if I zoom into the country, what's been happening? So that's India's urbanization in 1951, at the time of post-partition and independence. So we had only 5 cities with a population of 1 million, and 41 with about 1 lakh. And Gandhiji was right. Much of India lived in its 500,000 villages. So what happened by 61? You find the first 5 million city, Kolkata, building out at that time. That's 71, Mumbai coming up into that. That's 81, Delhi picking up. You can see a number of million cities starting to pick up in different parts of the country. This is the population growths. This is the size of number of settlements up there. That's 91. I guess when most of us had sort of come into service, so Mumbai becomes the first mega city, second Kolkata, Delhi and Chennai are far behind. That's 2001, and you can see how the build out of these cities sort of proceeding, and that's the latest census. So what do we see in the latest census? We have 3 cities which are mega cities with 10 million population. We have 53 cities with more than 1 million population. We have 833 million people who live in 0.6 lakh villages, 6.5 lakh villages, 0.65 million villages, and we have 377 million people who live in 8,000 centers. Fine, that's the mix. This is an important thing to understand, that the ratio between the number of urban centers and the rural centers is almost off by a factor of 1:100. And if you think that this is a landscape that is full of cities, if I showed you all the villages on it, it will be completely black. And that, I think, is an interesting opportunity India has, which some of us see that as a form of backwardness, others of us see that as an opportunity to be able to take people back to the villages. The challenge is to keep the balance together, and I'll show you that. I'll show you why that's important. So basically, this is a 2001 situation. As I said, 3 mega cities, 53 million plus cities, and that's the ratio between urban and rural. So, what is the trend for 2031? I mean, this is the world that you have to manage, right? Okay, and you can see, if you're in Maharashtra, this is a mega urban region. About whatever, almost 30 million people in Mumbai, 700. So there's about 35 million people in the Mumbai, Pune, Nasik axis as far as it's concerned. Look at the NCR area here. If you take all of that, another 30 million people here. Kolkata at 23. Of course, I'm not showing Bangladesh here because Dhaka actually is much larger than Kolkata in this region. Bangalore going up to more than 10.6. This is actually just this is not the UA. This is the municipality. The larger area may be about 14 or 15 million people. This may well become India's third or fourth largest urban center as far as that. So basically, a massive growth in urbanization, but yet, like I said earlier, India will have a much lower rate of urbanization than many other parts of the world. So that's what the numbers are like. 6 mega cities, 70 million plus cities. Of course, the big issue for us is how many Indians will live in medium and small towns, because that is where the growth is taking place, that is where the employment is created, and that is our fundamental challenge to build a bridge between rural and urban India. So the interesting thing of course about India, this is 2011 census, is we see this growth, but the growth is highly unequal. So if you take the top 100 cities, remember the 8,000 cities, and there's 6.5 lakh villages. Right? You take the top 100 cities, the top 100 cities produce about 43% of our GDP. Fine. So if you're a tax collector, this is the place that you actually go for. Fine. Like Mumbai is a big place, let's say. 16% of our population in these cities are producing 43% of the GDP. But look at the area they're producing it in. They're producing it in less than 0.25% of the land area of this country. Okay. Now this is where fact contradicts popular perception. Post Shingu, everybody's talking about cities taking everything, and that's not true. We actually have one of the most highly concentrated economic environments in the world, and that is one of the reasons why there's so much of regional inequality. This is, and it's not only because of the way that cities are, and historically, the reason is also there's tremendous concentration of. Unfortunately, the planning commission hasn't produced this since 2005. There's considerable concentration of agricultural output and also manufacturing output, even more important. In fact, the challenge for us is we need jobs here, right? But where's the manufacturing here? We need jobs in this entire region here in the north as the demographic shift takes place. Most of the manufacturing is concentrated in areas in which there's been concentration in the past. So there's a concentration of both rural and urban production. But I'll take you through this graph a little bit slowly. It's an important graph, and I'll take it, understanding this is very, very important. This looks at the history of this country since independence, all the censuses. It looks at the proportion of the population in different sizes of settlements, okay, from small hamlets, less than 1,000 people, which means 200 households, to the million plus cities, right? Got that? So this is small hamlets, small villages, medium-sized villages, large villages, etc. This line is the urban-rural line, right? So we've gone from whatever it is, 12%, 13% urbanization in 51 to about 31% just now, right? This is the urban-rural line. Now, what are the structural shifts that we can see? And this is important to understand. It's happening for two reasons, at least. One is, of course, demographic growth. So, obviously, if a village population size grows, it moves from one category to the other. The second thing is connectivity. Connectivity has changed dramatically, especially in the last 10 years or so. And I think many of you have been involved in doing this across the country. You've been involved in managing this. But the most dramatic trend that you see, as I said, Gandhiji was right in 48, and that is India not only lives in its villages, it lives in its small villages and hamlets. So, 63% of India lived in villages of a population size of less than 400 households. 1951. Okay, this is the imagination of India that many people in Parliament, because our Parliament is not exactly very young, live with, because that's their lived reality. What is the number from the 2011 census? 12%. We've dropped from 43% to 12%, and the next census is going to go into single-digit numbers. So fundamentally, India no longer lives in its small hamlets and villages. This is a structural shift that's taken place in the way that we live and who we are. Fine? But our political imagination and our systems of governance are not designed to take that into account. In fact, the fundamental challenge that we have is we have a rural development program that is fundamentally dealing with this challenge. But the category that's growing most dramatically is the medium size and, of course, the very large size villages. Actually, by definition, this 180 million people who are living in these large size villages could be classified as urban if male non-agricultural employment is more than 75%. This is a long, big academic debate. But the point is that this line could well be somewhere in between, and in that sense, we would not be 30% urban, we would be 40% urban. Okay? And certainly the aspiration of a lot of people in this, especially younger people, is to be more here than here. Right? So the fundamental development challenge that we have is to be able to create a process of rural development that takes a large number of people out of poverty here, to increase productivity, increase the number of jobs here, keep them relatively resource sparse, while increasing the people's quality of life. This is the same, fine. We have to do that because we have to feed 1.5 billion people. You cannot do what Russia did, and this is what China is absolutely paranoid about, of actually destroying its agricultural system by moving people too quickly off it. You have to have a significant number of people whose lives are also much better than what they were, otherwise they wouldn't stay there, to be able to manage the system. So the agrarian system is very critical for us. But this end, this million plus cities are also not a solution, as we saw, to the challenge of development. Right? So you cannot, as we've tried to do, export-led services growth, etc., etc., etc. The challenge actually lies in this area we call the missing middle. This about 210 million people in between here, who, especially as younger people become educated, seek for new aspirations, need to find adequate employment. And this is where the challenge of small and medium towns actually lies. We've been able through the SSA and other programs to increase access to education. Aspirations are going through the roof as far as that's concerned. But the challenge is the jobs obviously are not there in the agricultural sector, even in the allied industry sector. They have to come from manufacturing. The challenge, of course, is that manufacturing cannot work here, especially for those of you from northern states, because of very simple things. Bijli kahan? I mean, if you do not have more than 8 hours, less than 3 or 4 hours of power, how can you run manufacturing processes? If the roads are not there to provide you market access, how can you actually manage and produce output? So you have to have all these fundamental things, in a sense, bijli, sadak, pani, etc., and housing are critical for us to be able to create manufacturing opportunities. And the challenge, of course, on the other side is we have a 10% of GDP, mercantile trade deficit primarily with China. So we are importing goods from China which are produced cheaper than in India, and our people don't have jobs to seek. So this is, I think, the deep structural challenge where we have to go to a 4-part sort of strategy, one that deals with green and productive rural development. You can have some, service sector-led growth that's happening in Bangalore at the top end of the spectrum, but the middle has to be a mix of manufacturing and services. And this has to be broken down region by region and done in a systematic manner. And I can tell you one thing, at least, those of us who work a little bit on manufacturing policy, Professor Pani is an expert on that, we have a serious problem here. We have a crisis that's building, and it's building not only in northern and eastern India, but also in northeastern India. So, that's where I leave you with that. And this is true of the same structure there. I'll just show you a few states. Look at Gujarat. There's a lot of talk about Gujarat's model of development. What are we seeing here? We're seeing a saturation of the shift. This is the urban-rural line here. fine? So you're going to about 50%, just under 45% urbanization, and this transition is not actually taking place. And that of course is because Gujarat is actually quite diverse. You know, Kutch is one very different kind of a region, and so is Saurashtra. The challenge is the transition in Saurashtra. While southern Gujarat is doing particularly well in some particular areas, and you can see this. You can see also a large population people in million cities happening there. So, you know, state by state, and you can do this region by region. When you start looking at, I'll give you an example of another state that's not, not as urbanized. This is Rajasthan. So Rajasthan, you see a slow growth of urbanization, and you see, like I saw, the secular decline of small villages taking place, but there's still a large number of small hamlets because that's the nature of Rajasthan. As you go into the desert, you will increasingly have smaller hamlets because ecologically you can't sustain it otherwise. So this is a mix of both of ecological, environmental and development implications. Look at Tamil Nadu. Much more balanced form of development. If you look at the balance here, only 9% in the million plus cities, 10% in the 1 lakh to million cities. So very, very balanced sort of when you're talking about balanced regional development, and also a creeping urbanization. This is going to be probably India's most significant urban state. It's already almost 50%, and you see this decline in smaller settlements, both because of connectivity, better service delivery, etc. So what I'm saying is we need to also look at the structure and economic geography of how things are organized. That gives you an insight on what needs to be done. When we talk about balancing regional development and growth, the numbers are there. The census gives it to you. You only have to reach out and look at UP. UP has similar kinds of challenges. And in fact, the national average is dramatically affected by UP. So you see UP again, slow growth, but some saturation and some structural constraints that you're finding with UP. So this is happening, but at this end, we're not finding a significant shift. And the fundamental challenge, of course, in UP is job creation and value addition. So what's happening? The big shift that's happened in the last census period is that for the first time, the increment in urban population has been more than the increment in rural population. So this is the answer in a sense. It's the evidence. I'm not sort of that for the first time in the last 60 years, we have more people added to urban areas than rural areas. So the shift has started. I mean, obviously it's starting in states in which demographic transitions have started in the south, but the shift has started at the national level. But there's something else that most people actually don't know, and that is, if you look at the gross trend, and this is a political myth. The political myth is that cities are filling up and becoming a mess because lots of people are coming in from rural areas. That is completely untrue. And why is it completely untrue? Look at the 40-year secular trend. This is the components of urban population growth. The most important component of urban population growth, slightly changed in the last census period, has been the natural growth of cities. Okay, so city populations are very fertile. So natural growth of cities is the most important reason for the last, let's say about for the last 40 years, 60% of the growth is actually coming from natural growth. In this census period, we find an interesting new trend. We find this, which is the creation of new towns. There's a lot been written on that, and that's happening because of growth from below. Also, the expansion of urban areas. I'll show that to you in a second just now. So sprawl is becoming a very serious problem in urban India. And of course, there is a spurt in net rural to urban migration. Fine? But fundamentally, look at the ratio between this and this. Rural-urban migration has historically not been the most important reason for the growth of cities. The growth of cities has been endogenous. That may change. That may change depending on what happens in rural areas and what happens as far as the collapse of agrarian systems, especially in central India. But the current trend is that political story is not backed by any evidence. This is important to understand. So, and if you look at the last census period, the migration trends are interesting. They're happening in places where there's tremendous amount of economic growth. So there's a huge sucking noise happening out of Delhi for various reasons. And a lot of the transitions are there. Again, if you look at Maharashtra here, I'll just run through it very quickly. It's not true that there's a large amount of migration, at least. These are estimates because the census has not come out with its migration data as yet. So, what's happening? The reason that we talk about this urban explosion is because in our own lived experience, there is an explosion. Let me show you the satellite imagery from 3 cities. That's Delhi, 1992, 2000, 2011. Fine? That's our lived experience of the city. So there is an explosion, but it's an explosion, remember, that's happening in 0.2% of the land area of the country. Look at the city, Bangalore, 1992, 3.4 million people, 2001, 5.7, 2009, 8.5 million. Right? So there's a massive explosion, and if you travel around the city, you can see that. More interesting, Chandigarh, Nehru's favorite city, in terms of its view of modern development. There's a fantastic grid plan there by Corbusier. Right? See what's happening to that. That's the end of that in 2011. That's the end of grid plan development. So India, in a sense, has taken over what actually happens. And this is satellite data, so I'm not showing you anything that I've conjured up. So basically, the other thing that's happened very dramatically over the last 20 years or so, and I think you are party and sort of part of that process, is the growth of strategic infrastructure and the growth of course, the road networks. And the big ones, of course, GQ, East-West, North-South, East-West corridor. But interesting things to understand, and that is that the bulk of the new infrastructure development and the economic growth is actually happening along India's western coast. India's western coast is becoming like the eastern coast of China. We have serious challenges here in eastern India and the northeast. And the big, huge lost opportunities for us actually in South Asia are trade between India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, now Myanmar, and of course the ASEAN region. And this is important, because if you look at the growth of the ASEAN region, you look at the growth of East Asia, a lot of that has become because of economic activity. And it's clearly in India's interest to make that happen. We've been building out this infrastructure, but we forget other things. So this is the growth of key ports and airports, and then again you can see here the differential location of ports. Look at Gujarat and the development of ports. So Gujarat has taken a particular development strategy, and we find that in many other states, in spite of the Konkan Railway building out here, we've not really been able to build out an opportunity either to import, because we're seriously challenged in terms of gas and oil and petrochemicals and petroleum-based products, but also to export from these corridors. In fact, these corridors are primarily driven to be able to connect major centers of production like Ludhiana, Delhi, etc., with the major ports. On the East Coast, much weaker connections as far as that's concerned. And other things that we often forget: you cannot create the jobs, you cannot industrialize without power. I mean, we use power inefficiently, right? And of course, our power plants are located in particular areas depending on where the coal is available, typically in these cases. But here again, you can see that this is a critical precursor to be able to make sure that energy is available to people. So I mean, just because you have power plant doesn't mean that you still have energy. And similarly, something that we often forget is, because our transportation systems essentially run on liquid fuels, the location of refineries and pipelines are very, very important, right? And of course, in the medium run, the most important thing for us, especially in the context of climate change, is the question of where gas is going to be available. So the connection to critical gas networks is going to be absolutely essential, because it's very simple. Natural gas produces much less carbon per unit energy that's produced. So if you look at the development of this region, a lot of it is because of the unconditional finds in the Bombay High Find in the 70s. And now, of course, you have two major basins that are building out here, the KG Basin, the Kaveri Basin. And of course, the great lost opportunity for us in terms of our own relationship with our neighbors is Bangladeshi and Myanmari gas, which is now all going in that direction. It's going out towards China. So how these networks actually build themselves out will determine how urbanization will happen, how jobs are created, and how processes think. So what I'm saying is that when we think about development and changes, we have to look at the underlying processes that are there. I mean, I could have talked a lot about more micro things that happen, micro level things that happen at the city level at January, X, Y, and Z. But these are the things that we often mix. And eventually, if we have to move to a more renewable-based system or energy system, it's going to be the gas and hydro that determines where they happen. Of course, our hydro resources are located in particular areas, and there are big challenges there. Getting our wind turbines and other photovoltaics up are going to be important. So, given that context, I'll just show you some broad trends to look at. Like I said, I showed you the global trends there, but I'll show you the national trends that are there. Essentially, what we've seen just now in the last 20 years or so is a post-liberalization boom in India's urban economy, especially in this phase. So you can see this, the ratio of the urban to the rural. That's another view of the same thing. So basically, we are saying about 55% plus of India's GDP comes from urban areas. But the interesting thing is not that. The interesting thing, of course, is the sectoral composition of that growth. So, if you look at the sectoral composition, so it's growing, obviously. Maybe I should show you the next slide. Basically, 4 or 5 sectors are actually driving this: manufacturing, trade, transportation, banking and real estate. But there's a serious challenge here. The serious challenge is that in the last, well, in the 2000s, manufacturing sector, the one that's actually going to create other jobs, is actually declining as a share of value added. This is a real problem. And we find other sectors like transportation, storage and communication, so basically cell phones and a lot of things moving around in trucks and railway wagons becoming quite important. And as we financialize our economy, banking and finance, and of course, unproductive investment, speculation in real estate, etc., becoming quite important as far as concerned. Business and public administration, public administration and defense, the business that you're in, essentially remaining a relatively rough share. So this is a matter of great concern. So what I'm saying is, this you can look at state level, and unfortunately, because we don't actually have good district statistics, and we have no urban statistics, we should be able to look at this for every city in the country. Because when you look at this and you look at the structure of employment, you understand what's happening. But unfortunately, our statistical system does not estimate this for cities. This is my biggest fight that we've been having with CSO and the National Statistical Commission for a long time. If 60% of your GDP is coming from cities, and it's coming from like 200 of them, and you have no idea of where it's coming from, and the NSS doesn't help you to look at employment, you're basically flying blind. You're flying blind in the middle of a cyclone. You're in deep trouble. So just as a quick, this is also a very important slide. It's a very simple slide. It basically looks at the all-India breakup of employment and GDP structure. So what we're saying, and I'll do this slowly, is that the urban formal sector, that is, the firms, the PSUs, Indian corporate sector, transnationals, provide about 5% of India's employment, fine, and they produce about a quarter of India's output. So 5% of the people are producing 1/4 of the output. That's the reason why we've had so many people, including our children and our grandchildren, who want to go out here, right? But the surprise is not that. The surprise is the urban informal sector, which is about 25% of India's employment, is producing slightly more than the urban formal sector. Okay, this is a big shocker when we produce them. This is a paper that some of us wrote a couple of years back. And in hindsight, it seems obvious. Those of us who worked in municipalities and work with urban communities. Poor people actually work very hard in India, and they're actually very productive because they internalize a lot of the costs of having bad cities, not having good water, continually getting ill, having housing that's terrible. Fine. So in some senses, the interesting opportunity for us is to try to get this right. Unfortunately, we're not doing enough on that count. And of course, we know this. This is a big reservoir of people who don't have adequate employment. Productivity is low. So about 70% of the people in rural areas are producing about 45% of the output. Fine. So our real thing is to be able to reduce this proportion, increase that. And of course, the challenge is that if you're going to increase it through urban informality, that means the living conditions in cities are going to become worse and worse. Things are going to become, very, very badly off. And this is what we're seeing continually. So the question is, how can we increase the productivity and the quality of life of people in both these areas in this? Because the linkage between urban informal sector employment and village India is actually quite strong. If you're able to provide better economic conditions and greater productivity in urban areas, especially in the informal sectors of the poor, it does have an impact on rural employment. So, where does the employment happen? Sorry. Yeah.
I feel this informal sector
Yeah.
is not accounted in
No, not really. So there are two things. Let's say the black economy may not be counted to the GDP, and there are some debates about that. Some economists feel that they are. But the informal sector is counted in the GDP because now much of the informal sector is monetized. Okay, so I mean there are some questions about women's work and a whole range of other things, but the informal sector produces pretty much a lot of both your products, your products and services in the country. You'll be surprised by the proportion of things that we consume that come from the informal sector. And again, the informal sector is both services and manufacturing. Right? So each of us who have people who work for us, that's in the informal sector, there's no social protection that actually exists, whether it's in terms of health insurance or X and Y and Z. And this is the thing. I think the big challenge that we're trying to deal with just now is that we've tried to build the beginnings of a social safety net in rural areas. The beginnings, it's just the beginnings. But in urban areas, and there's some noise about it happening at the moment in policy circles, we actually have a big gap as far as that's concerned. Well, it comes from the NCUS and from the national accounts. Sorry? Well, this comes from an official report that took 5 years and went to the Prime Minister. A. And B, interestingly, if you go to the national accounts, those of you who are economists and look at it, there are pretty good estimates of it, and that was a little surprising to us when we did it, because it's there. It's been in the national accounts for a while. It's just that we haven't seen it, but it's there. So anyway, I'll show you. So let me show you something else. So this is the structure of the unorganized sector, fine? And you find that the structure of the unorganized sector is a little different from the organized sector. So look at this, fine? Okay, trade, very, very big as a proportion, fine? Transport communication also quite big and growing. This is construction here. This is manufacturing. So all of this here is services. And this makes sense. 55% of your GDP plus is coming from services. The unorganized sector has a predominance of services. And many of us, I mean, if you're in an IT firm in Bangalore, if you look at the number of people who are servicing you, they could land up to a significant number. However, there are limits to that because it's not necessarily productive employment. So let me show you something else. It may partially answer your question. This is a long-term trend. I'm going to run this through very, very quickly, which looks at from the early reforms to now, okay, of the primary, secondary, and tertiary employment, okay. Men, women, rural, men, women, urban. So what are the trends that you're seeing here? Fine. You're seeing first, secondary and tertiary employment is growing as far as men is concerned. Fine. So let's say there's some kind of a trend here where in rural agricultural occupations, or let's say primary sector occupations, there's a decline happening. No significant decline happening as far as women is concerned here. But look at the trends in urban areas. So the first thing in urban areas is more men than women. In fact, I won't show you the graphs. I haven't brought them today. But one of the most dramatic trends that we're seeing with the SSA and the increasing employment is that there is a relatively low share of educated women in urban areas who are actually coming into the workforce. And when I'm talking about social transformation, that becomes one of the most important factors in that process. One of the key factors that drove East Asia's growth was the entry of educated women into the workforce, especially into the manufacturing workforce. Okay, and in India it's just the inverse that's happening, and so there are a whole range of questions that I get. So essentially, what you're seeing here is that in urban areas, women are entering the tertiary sector, and the secondary sector share is actually relatively small. The challenge is your education levels are such that tertiary sector high value employment is very difficult to get hold of. How many people are going to go into the IT sector or IT in EAS? You require a certain level of education to make that happen. People can't afford to do that, or the quality of education is not good enough. Look at the structure of this, and it's even more dramatic when you look at that. This is a decline in the share of male rural employment in the primary sector. Okay, look at the trend from 78 onwards, 25-year trend that's there. Look at female employment, not declining very significantly. Look at the urban area shift that's taking place. Look at the growth in services. Where is this happening? This is happening in informal sector services. Look at women also participating in the service sector, also home-based manufacturing here. If you look at textiles, for example, that's a classic example of global supply chains moving into the household. So this is happening. This is all NSS data. I'm not sort of inventing it, but these changes are happening as we speak. We're not necessarily aware that they're there. And of course, unfortunately, if we had that for every city, when you're working on a mission or you're working as a municipal commissioner or X and Y, Z, you'd be able to actually plan and deal with these questions, etc. But the most important question is not that. The most important question, this comes from the latest economic survey, is the ratio of productivity and employment share. So we have a large number of people in agriculture and allied activities which have very low productivity compared to people in the services sector, especially in financial services. Look at the ratio, 1:7. Fine. So it's obvious that all the smart people who go to universities want to run off and go into these jobs if they don't go outside the country, because there's a step here. What we need to do is we need to be able to move more people into this segment, expand the base here, and raise the productivity. Raising productivity growth is very, very critical as far as that's concerned. And there are a whole range of reasons why that's not there. Infrastructure is one critical one. The difficulty, because of license Raj still sort of functioning in many areas, of actually setting up and building enterprises, and the fact that there is no underlying support sector. Again, to answer your question here, This is the share in yellow and green of organized and unorganized sector employment, right? And you can see some sectors in which there is very significant share of GDP. So manufacturing, for example, large proportion in the unorganized sector. Similarly, in the area of trade, you'd find a significant portion of unorganized sector employment. But the most important question is here. It is looking at the ratio of productivity. Sorry. Yeah. No, banking and finance. Yeah, this is unorganized. Green is unorganized. This is organized. So banking and finance is very small. Fine. And if you look at public administration here, it's all in the formal sector. Right? This is from the national accounts. So the most important one here is the ratio of productivity between the formal and the informal sector. In trade, the productivity of the formal and the informal sector are almost similar. Right? So the key challenge for us is to move into sectors in which you have both employment growth and you have economic output growth. And this is just, I'll probably try and end with this just now. This looks at the period, early reform period, 1990 to 2004. It looks at the average employment growth and looks at the average growth in output. And what do you see here? Large proportion of people in agriculture, employment growth is low, obviously, absorption is difficult, and the growth of output is very small. What are the big ones which are showing employment growth? Construction, bubble at the top, transportation, communication not so bad. What has happened in the last 5 years? Interesting shift. Okay, look at the two. Look at where agriculture has grown. So there's been a growth that's taken place, but the employment growth is not taking place. This is our fundamental challenge. So I think we're sort of almost running out of time. I'll just show you a couple of slides which I think will answer the first question that I had here about inequality. This is dated because we have stopped collecting this data, and we're trying to tell the RBI they should do this round again. This is the caste-wise distribution of wealth in rural area in 2002. Right? So what do you see here? You see the upper caste there, and you see the SCs and ST down here. Right? So we know this. So upper caste, OBC, forward caste, etc., and SC, ST. The theory, if Ambedkar was right, would be that this would be disrupted in urban India because of productivity growth, because of education, etc. The challenge is the numbers are higher, obviously, because there's more income in urban areas, there's more consumption, there's more wealth, but the rank order is the same. Fine? Starting with forward caste, ending with scheduled caste. This to me is one of the most disturbing pieces of sort of data that I've seen for a really long time. And that is that it is this that is helping, and we don't have a gender differential on this, so gender differential is probably in laws, we don't have to collect that data. Is that we are reproducing, non-Hindus. Okay, there's a little bit of a mix up there because it adds up different things, you have to break it up by states, and that's a little skewed because in the northeast, there are a number of people, because of Schedule 6, etc., who are slightly better off than other places. So, so when you break that down, you find there's not too much difference. So this is a very serious challenge to us. So I'll just sort of end very quickly with a few things. So the biggest challenge, of course, for us is this is great stuff. We can do many things. There are lots of processes that are in change. We might be in control of it. But to my mind, the biggest challenge that we have is a mixture of institutional and human. We basically have a huge country, tremendous amount of complexity, lots of things happening, many of them that we're not aware of. Right? We just don't have enough people to manage it. Okay, so I mean, there's a paper which I should be publishing quite quickly where we looked at pretty much the entire cadre from 75 till 2012 using DOPT data, and looked to see how many people had actually done urban postings, how many of them had a formal training, and we found that less than 5% of the people actually had any kind of training that could be, counted as something that could help you in urban areas, and actually it was less than 1%. So even though people have done about, I think, 25 to 27% of the postings have been urban at some point of time. So the challenge fundamentally is, we have an economy which is now a $2 trillion economy, 60% plus of which comes from urban areas, fine, and we will have most of the incremental employment will come from urban areas. We do not have people like yourselves who are actually exposed to and trained to deal with these questions. That's no reflection on you. It's a reflection on our system and the way it works. And this is a serious problem for us, because that's where the bulk of our resources and our opportunities lie. So what we really have, like I said here, is we have less than 20,000 people managing a very large population, 400, 500 million people, which is larger than the United States, right? And less than 5% of these people, as I said, are educated in dealing with urban areas. And this is counting everybody. This is not only the IAS and the IPS, but also the judiciary, which is very important, the MPs and the MLAs. And the bigger problem, of course, is that we have a huge gap where the middle level cadre to manage these processes is smaller than the top brass. So how will implementation happen? This is the big challenge of setting up municipal cadres and doing that thing. So we are fundamentally imagined as a country which will be forever rural. And unfortunately, that has changed. And that is reflected in the imagination of the Constitution. Okay? And even if you look at the 73rd and 74th amendments, the 73rd, for whatever good it's done, is probably doing much better than the 74th. But the much of the value added, a lot of the incremental opportunities and the transformational opportunities around inequality, around social justice, etc., are a lot easier in urban areas than others. But we don't have enough institutional capacities to do that. And unless we have the people, we can't make this happen. So I think what a lot of us, like Professor Pani and myself, have been doing for the last many years is trying to educate and build this new cadre of people. We don't need 10 or 15 or 20, we need 100,000, 200,000 people to manage this. It's not possible without that. If you look at how the Chinese manage the system, they manage the system, I mean, the party is absolutely phenomenal in the way that they prepare and develop and train over 500,000 people to manage the system. You can't manage 7, 8, 10% growth without that. It just doesn't work. And we need to strengthen the state to make that happen. If we do not strengthen the state, there's no chance that we can enable these processes to happen. Even though while you may liberalize and you do a million other things, but fundamentally, the state is a central institution in this process and in this political settlement that we have sort of enabled 60 years ago. So, sorry if I haven't taken a lot of time, but I thought I'd lay out a sort of sweeping set of arguments, and then, whatever it's worth, we can have a bit of a conversation, or at least you can ask Narendra lots of difficult and bad questions which I've sort of raised here. So thank you very much.
We have out of time, but I think we can cut 10 minutes of break. At least 10 minutes we can have some discussion. Those of you who want to ask questions.
बताइए. I've combined what in population?
You combine transport and communication together and showing that it is coming on the top so far as activities are concerned.
Okay, yes.
But I feel transport itself is a very, very important sector.
Yes.
And communication itself is a very, very important sector.
Yes.
I think it is better if you show the performance of both the sectors separately.
Absolutely, I would agree with you there. I wouldn't agree with you more. The challenge is that there's incompatibility with the two data streams, but you're right. They're two different and they're governed by very different dynamics. So I can say I bored you to death talking too long.
Yeah. When you're talking about ecological footprint and drawing a correlation with economic development, is it like amongst people who are studying urban development, is it like a taken that economic footprint will be directly correlated with economic development? As in, do we have case studies where economic development did take place and still the ecological footprint was not as bad? What are these models, if you have studied?
Yeah, so see, the ecological footprint basically is related to the amount of ecological services that the environment can provide you. So an ecological footprint of 1 is equal to, let's say, all the services that can be provided by the earth. Globally, we've been in a deficit since the mid-1990s on that. At the moment, we're at about a 15% deficit, etc. There are many examples of that. The challenge is, so in India's classic, city after city, pre-colonial cities were remarkably good examples of how you could manage, let's say, water supply, very simply, without having to draw upon a whole range of energy sources to be able to manage them. The challenge that we have today is, let's say, if you take a city like Bangalore, for example, Bangalore has a very serious problem as far as water is concerned. Extremely serious. In fact, technically, according to the Supreme Court notifications, Bangalore has no more legal right to cover water anymore. Right? How did Bangalore manage earlier? It manages through a series of tanks. That's how much of, let's say, Peninsula India managed. Obviously, with the tank-based system of water supply, you can't have cities of 10 million people or more. You have to sort of bring in more water than that because there isn't enough. But even today, there's enough studies, including from ISC and otherwise, which show you that maybe about 50 to 60% of the water sources of the city could actually be managed with a mixture of good catchment treatment, by a mixture of recharge, by a mixture of efficiency in actual use. So, you will still have to transport water from the Kaveri, but you can do it within, within the resource base that you have. The problem, of course, is that we waste about 45% of our water that comes into the city because it leaks. And that's a tricky question, because you want to fix that leak, you've got to spend many thousand crores of capital investment to fix that. Plus another very important thing, you have to densify the city towards the center. And that is a very complicated problem because the land markets are pushing you towards the outside. So what I'm saying is that even within this country, there are very interesting and good examples of how you can manage, and I've taken water as a particular example. You can manage by and large within your own resources. But you have to have a multiple set of interventions. You've got to do efficiency, you've got to do recycling, you've got to make sure that you stop leaking, and you manage your catchments better. And that means that you can't only work within the PHED or the water resources department. You have to coordinate between multiple things, and as we know, that's a really hard job to do because economic forces are pulling you in different directions, and that's complicated. I think maybe this week you'll start coming into that kind of a process, and that's politically very it's not an easy thing to do. Yeah.
Have you ever correlated, or is there any study that has been undertaken which has a correlation to the natural resource part of it? What is the reason why the urban settlements are more concentrated only in this regions, whereas we have resources of minerals found even in continents like Australia, but we find very little urban settlements as well as Australia is concerned. Is there any correlation study that is
Sure. Okay. So quick thing. Source of that data is the UN Pop Division's projections for 2025. So that's UN statistics, the global stuff that you saw. The data that you saw for India was a mix of work that we've done and also from the census. So that's the source, and give you an idea of where they came from. So to answer the Australia question, Australia is primarily a desert. Okay. I mean, it's a large continent, but most of Australia is a desert. You can't actually inhabit much of Australia. The only areas that you can inhabit are actually along the coast, and especially the coastal plains, where you actually have enough water to be able to sustain agriculture. And because they became a primarily urban culture by the 1950s, their populations are concentrated in the areas where first, there's a path dependence here, where first there was agricultural productivity, so Murray-Darling Basin, so you look at Melbourne, Victoria, etc. And then the population concentrated in those cities, and the economic structure changes. They couldn't go back into agriculture. They didn't want to go back into agriculture. So that's why you find a relatively small population, less than 20 million people, with 85% urbanization along largely the coasts, and in particular areas, especially the southwestern coast of Australia, even though there's Brisbane and all. So that's the history of Australia. The challenge for us in South Asia is that, a little bit of history to that. We've had a very stable settlement structure for 2,000 years. So if you look at the 1901 census, let's say, we had about 1,500 settlements. We have 8,000 just now, right? And that system had persisted for almost, let's say, for 1,000, 1,500 years. Why? Because it was based on an agrarian economy that was relatively stable, and trade routes that were also relatively stable. Otherwise, why would you have Jaisalmer sitting in the middle of the desert? Jaisalmer is a very important trading link, and similarly, why if you go to Leh, you find Leh being the size that it was, because they were part of a whole set of trade linkages which were very extensive in the subcontinent that linked all of these places. So it is a mixture of trade, of economic activity that defined where these settlements would actually develop. And then you find in the middle of the 19th century, the British coming in and introducing major changes in the infrastructure. So for example, if you look at cotton trade in the northern parts of Madhya Pradesh now, what is called Madhya Bharat area, etc. The cotton trade used to go to the Ganga and then come down to Calcutta. And then what happened? The railways came in, first from Bombay, and then the line that came from Calcutta to Nagpur, etc. That changed the entire movement of goods and of course later services, and new settlements started building out around those major flows, and that's why I showed you strategic infrastructure being very, very important to base that on. So then you started finding centers in locations where the resources were not necessarily available. And then of course we had freight equalization, which made it even more complicated. But even now if you look at it, if you look at the belt there, if you just look at the satellite map, you can see it. Chhattisgarh, parts of Orissa, all the way up to Gadchiroli in Maharashtra, etc. That belt historically, if you go back to Habib's Atlas of Mughal India, that was a blank area, it was called forest. And it's still there for particular reasons, because we've not been able to develop those regions adequately, and the basis for employment, in spite of Durg, Bilaspur, etc., 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 has been quite limited. So typically populations aggregate where there's livelihoods, and we've been promoting them in particular areas.